Well, the time is just gone 8:13 a.m. on News and Views on this beautiful day of Jooma once again. Now, this is clearly a very significant development in terms of what we intend discussing this morning with independent researcher on Middle East and Africa, Mariam Çarikçi. We're talking about the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and we're talking about the leader who made a statement in a video address talking about the PKK, his movement no longer seeking a nation state ahead of a ceremony to actually lay down arms. Now, in February, a written statement by Abdullah Ocalan called for the group where he founded to disband, saying that the Turkish Parliament should establish a commission to oversee disarmament and take steps to manage the peace process. And saying further that the Kurdish existence has been recognized and therefore our primary objective has been achieved. Mariam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Juma Mubarak to you and welcome.
Walaikum salam. Jazakallah, Uncle Inayat. Thank you.
Mariam, how significant is this development and this announcement by the PKK, and also the fact that this movement is no longer seeking a nation state?
This is an incredibly significant day today, considering that they're going to be having a symbolic laying down of arms. So the PKK essentially has been fighting a guerrilla war against Turkey for over 4 decades, and the conservative estimates of around 40,000 people have been killed over that time. So this announcement is extremely important. Particularly because it's been at the core of domestic, repression around terrorism and laws around Kurdish organizations and so on, but also the regional impact because the PKK is not just confined to Turkey, but has branches in Syria, Iran, and northern Iraq. So this message from Abdullah Ocalan, as you mentioned at the outset, has basically set forward the principle that Kurdish identity and aims have actually been achieved and recognized, which basically puts the entire process or the entire dream of Kurdistan as a separate state, basically on ice, or essentially basically putting it away, off the table. And this, I think, is going to impact, like I said, the region quite significantly, but it would also impact other actors who've used the PKK as a means of destabilizing the region, particularly actors like Israel, the US, and the EU.
Yes, but also, Miriam, I think, as you mentioned, apart from just the regional implications, looking at the PKK, and you spoke about Israel, the likes of the United States of America as well, and this is an organization that has been designated as a terrorist organization by both the United States of America and the European Union. And just to understand, how this is likely to play out and what does this actually mean even for Turkey?
Yes, absolutely. I think one thing we must also recognize is that the PKK is a an organization that it has been designated as a terrorist organization, but it's different from the Kurdish population in general. So, the conflation of the PKK as being representative of all Kurds is also incorrect. And this is where we see actors like, the US, EU, and Israel, um, basically using that conflation between the PKK and Kurds as one as a means of promoting the PKK's aims, despite it being designated as a terrorist organization. So, this is again where we are confounded or confronted with the hypocrisy of the West, where we look at Hamas as a resistance movement against a very real occupation that's not been recognized. It's actually been designated as a terrorist organization, whereas the PKK, despite being considered a terrorist organization, is still being or still has been supported financially and organizationally because they help the destabilization of the region, which is one of the aims of those actors. So they have been instrumentalized, and this is where the Kurdish population themselves have become, I think, weary of the PKK's politics, where it was very popular in the early 80s and 90s. The shift in terms of support for the PKK has significantly declined. In Turkey, you've seen actually Kurdish dominated areas going to the polls and voting, in fact, for the AKP or for the GHP. But we don't see a spike in support for the own Kurdish parties because of the link to the PKK. So this is where it becomes a bit confusing, Uncle Inayat, because you have the US supporting the PKK's offshoot in Syria because of the war against ISIS. So the PKK, which is called the PYD in Syria, um, has been supported by the US openly as a partner, whereas its NATO ally Turkey absolutely does not recognize it as a peacemaker in the region. So today's ceremonial laying down of arms, which is planned for later today, is actually going to be, a litmus test to ask, whether or not this is real peace, the beginning of real peace, or the recalibration of the manipulation of the PKK as an actor in the region. Because we have to recognize, pardon me for going on so long, but I think it's important for us to understand that Abdullah Öcalan is not a monolith, and and the organization is not homogenous. So while he has been very has loomed large over the organization for over 40 years, his influence has limits. And so we've seen now the decentralization of the military field commanders in the Kandil Mountains in northern Iraq. So what it means is that there are risks of um, you know uh, um, a pushback of Öcalan's authority. So you actually have hardline factions, particularly amongst the younger fighters or those who are linked to the Syrian side of the PKK, that may actually not be happy with the disarmament and would seek to use their influence as a spoiler, to extract more concessions. So yes, definitely, it's a mix of the region, but also of international politics. And this is why I think Turkey has been in such a conundrum, because it hasn't been able to, for all these decades, deal effectively with the PKK without having um, other factors sabotage or almost re root the peace process.
Mariam, you've just answered what my next question was going to be with regard to the risks that are involved, and also the wider implications for the region as well. And considering that, you mentioned the presence in many of the countries, whether we're looking at Syria, we're looking at parts of Iran, or also in Iraq as well, but also taking a look at regional implications for someone like Israel, for example, where the Zionist entity has been actively supporting the PKK.
And Abdullah Öcalan made a very interesting statement recently. In addition to the comments on the recognition of the Kurdish aims by the Turkish state, he also mentioned that Israel has been promising the Kurds a state for many decades, but in his view, he will not allow the Kurds to be manipulated by Israel. And this leads us to looking at the history between the PKK and the Palestinian resistance. Now, it would almost feel as though you're putting, very different organizations into the same basket. But it's interesting to look at the historical support that the PKK in its early formation gave to the Palestine Liberation Organization. So there was an understanding in the early years that Palestine is almost a red line, and that Israel has no right to the occupied lands. However, as the PKK, evolved over the years, and power structures obviously need patrons, and that's where Israel became an active participant in the conflation of the war between Turkey and the PKK, where it actually trained many of the PKK members and provided them with military reinforcements, and even with very technical training because of its own surveillance capacity. And so we see the contradiction there between the origins of the PKK and its affiliation to the PLO, and how it's evolved to become an opportunistic organization. And here's where we also see the break between the PKK's understanding of the PLO's legitimacy, and looking at Hamas as a legitimate representative of the Palestinians. So, because the PKK are very much secular focused, you're not going to find necessarily, devout Muslim participants in the PKK. There's very much a slant towards a secularist Marxist view, which makes them sympathetic to the PLO and not to Hamas. So it becomes, a bit murky when we look at how many different factors can actually impact upon not just the success of disarmament of the PKK, but also sabotage the Palestinian resistance.
Well, that's a very, very interesting development. But let's just take a look at Turkey, and how is Turkey likely to respond, Erdogan in a particular, and more importantly, as far as this armament process is concerned, what sort of support, or what would the nature of the support be on the part of Erdogan in Turkey?
So it has been initiated from the state side. So I mean, it's been very interesting to see how many prisoners have been released on early released. That's PKK affiliates who've been detained over the years. They've been released now, including mid-level guerrillas, and that I think is something you would not have seen at all over the past 40 years. This is definitely a significant gesture coming from Erdogan. So what it seems to be is a signal to the Kurdish community that Turkey is serious about re-examining its past with the Kurdish community, and also to revisit the idea of opening up to cultural and ethnic recognition. So you have remember that the Kurdish language was banned; they were not allowed to speak Kurdish. Since the early 90s, there was a very direct repression of Kurdish identity, and so I think the reaching out to the PKK, particularly because of Ocalan's change, I think is very significant. It's also important to understand that the Kurdish language is now getting a lot of attention, particularly in universities. And while we in South Africa are used to having so many official languages, it's not been the case for Turkey. But now you're seeing local government use of Kurdish in public services, which I think is incredibly significant.
Yes, Mariam, is there any particular reason why this symbolic ceremony that is taking place in terms of laying down arms is taking place in Iraq?
Because it is the headquarters of the PKK in the Kandal Mountains, and because that has been the site of a large part of the fighting has been in northern Iraq. So the reason for this, I think, is more um, to create an environment of I guess, tacit understanding and acceptance from the Turkish public, because, as we've said, over 40,000 people have been killed. Excuse me, over 40,000 people have been killed, and the amount of soldiers that have died over the 4 decades. In Turkey, the shaheeds are celebrated and mourned. Even in public spaces, you'll see that. So it has a lot to do with the psyche of the Turkish public. So putting down these arms symbolically, I think, is a way of saying, it's not just writing or signing off on a piece of paper, but there's actually, you can see them physically giving up arms.
Well, Mariam, it's going to be quite interesting to see because this is a major game changer. I mean, 40 years is a long time, and to see what actually develops, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in Turkey within itself as well, because we are led to believe that the media, journalists, observers to the event will be witnessing this occasion. So it's going to be quite a historic moment.
No, certainly. Look, it is a ceremony, right? So it is stage managed. Let's not forget that. So we have senior members of the PKK who will be representing on behalf of Abdullah Öcalan. Obviously, he's still on Imrala Island in prison. Um, and then you have the senior representatives of the military of Turkey. So yes, definitely, it's going to be a watershed event. But we must also remember that in 2012 we had the opening towards the it was called the Kurdish opening, and that was sabotaged. And after that, things soured again. So I think this needs to be very carefully. Managed in a sense of expectations. We have to understand that it's going to be a process, but that the goodwill must be created by these symbolic steps.
Well, cautious optimism, Mariam. I think that is, at this point in time, and let's see what actually develops. And obviously, we will see what the outcome of this symbolic gesture is going to be this today when the ceremony takes place. But for now, we thank you, Shukran, as always, Mariam, and please take care. And inshallah, connecting next week once again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi
Amen.
wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam. Jazakallah.
Mariam Jooma joining us once again on this Friday morning. And again, we definitely will be watching these developments with interest. And let's just see what actually pans out. A quick break, and when we get back, the Zionist blueprint behind Pakistan's new military posture. And this morning, we are going straight to Islamabad in Pakistan to get the take of the Professor Junaid Ahmed.